and welcome to another Scots Whay Hae podcast. And today I'm joined by writer Robert J. Harris. Hello, Robert.
Hello, good to see you.
And you. And we're going to talk about the latest in the Richard Hannay Returns series. I have a copy here for our
Good for you.
viewers. And it's called Redfalcon, which is out now, published with Polygon Books.
Yeah.
Before we talk about Redfalcon, though, can you tell us about the series and how you came to write it?
Oh, well, the first book in this series of Richard Hannay was The 31 Kings, which came out in 2017, I think. At that point, I was writing a series of children's books for Florist Books, their Kelpie series, called The Arthur Conan Doyle Mysteries. There's a Scottish connection there too. But my son, Jamie, who works in publishing in Edinburgh, he also does some writing, mostly online writing, but he does quite well with that. So he was over for the weekend visiting home because he lives in Edinburgh.
Right. And
we were out on the porch having a drink and a cigar and chatting about books and writing. And I asked him, I said, well, if there was any book you could write at all, if somebody would pay you to write a book of your choice, what would you really want to write? And so he told, I won't get into what his project was. And he asked me the same thing. And I said, well, I'm really a big fan of John Buchan. And in his last novel, Sick Heart River, he suggested that all the heroes of his previous stories would all be getting together. This was now 1940 when he was governor of Canada and just signed Canada into the war. And at the end of his last novel, which shortly after which he died, he suggests that Richard Hannay and all the other characters from his books would all be getting together and actually serving king and country again, as they did in the Great War and some of the earlier books. And this had stayed with me over a couple of years, thinking, if he'd lived longer, he would have written that story, a World War II story. And then I thought, it'd be interesting, maybe somebody should write it. And so I had an idea for what the story would be. But to me, it was a fantasy. I didn't know, I was writing children's books, for sort of like early teens. And I didn't know anybody would buy a book like that off of me if there was enough interest in it. So anyway, I was talking to Jamie, my son, about that there, and he said, Dad, and he worked for Berlin and Polygon. He said, don't you know that they publish all of Buchan's books? They're probably really interested in something like that. I said, oh, right, okay. So he mentioned it to them, and I got an email and said, yeah, could you send us a proposal for it? So I took my general idea, which was to have Hannay being sent to Paris to rescue some agent who's being held prisoner by Nazi agents there, just before the Germans come in. There was a nice kind of ticking clock thing on the thing, and had to build that up into a proper novel. So I was very surprised and gratified that they actually offered me a deal right up front to publish it without having any text or anything. Yeah. Just the strength of what I'd done before, and on the fact that they really liked the outline, which I worked really hard on to say, look, to prove I can write a book for grown-ups. I thought, no, it's a really good outline, everything worked out in detail. And they liked that so much, they signed me up to write the book. And it was a big success. It got a lot of publicity and great reviews. And I always mention it was one of the Scotsman's 50 books of the year. And that's including non-fiction, poetry, everything. So that was a compliment. So, they were interested in more after that, which I had not thought of at the time. Mm-hmm. I kind of thought this would be a one-off. Right. But no, there was quite readers and reviewers and the publisher all demanded more. So here we are at the third book now of the series. So that's how it all came about. And I'll let you ask any further questions from that.
Well, how do you approach writing in another author's style? How did you kind of get into John Buchan mode, if you like?
Yeah, well, it's a matter of just kind of reading and rereading the books over and over and absorbing it. So that it's a bit like being bilingual. The way you use a language enough that you actually can do it naturally. And so I did that, and it seems to have come off that it does read like John Buchan. I mean, there's certain, phrases like, being in a funk and stuff like that, certain things that we wouldn't say now. And you think, yeah, that's something that comes up. There's certain ways of expressing things that, you bear those in mind specifically. So you're using certain phrases now that are very much of the time. But at the same time, you're just getting your head into the general rhythm of it. And Buchan, of course, is a very good writer. It's very clear, easy prose. And so when you get into that mode, it proved to be quite easy. I shouldn't say it was easy, but having read Buchan, particularly the Hannay books for this, and having all the research on it and worked the plot out, when I came to writing it, it seemed to flow really well. I got it written in really good time and turned it in in good time, and really enjoyed doing it because I had the story all worked out. I wasn't hitting any bumps in it. And I really enjoyed getting into the characters and the setting in France and Paris. And it was actually, sometimes books are really hard to write. This one, obviously it was work doing it, but it was a really nice experience for me in doing it.
And so returning to them for a subsequent second and now third novel has been a pleasure as well. You get to spend, because they read as though you've enjoyed writing them, I think.
Yes, yes. Well, first of all, when I mean, as I say, readers and reviewers alike demanded more. Alan Massey review said, "Well, they can have more adventures after this one." And this, I think, well, that's easy for you to say. I've got to write it. So I was trying to think of a further World War II story, which is what Redfalcon is now. But at the time, I couldn't think of one. I didn't have a plot for a World War II. So I was out walking my dog, which is a good time. If you're in the shower or walking the dog, it's good to let your mind wander. So I was thinking, what did I do in the 31 Kings I could do in another book, something similar to kind of kick it off. And as well as the plot of carrying Richard Hannay on into 1940 in the Second World War, I brought them together with the Gorbals Diehards, which is another series done by Buchan, but there's 3 books of those. And Hannay had never encountered them, but there were crossover characters like Archie and that, who were in both series and in the Lethen series as well. And I thought that might be interesting to have, supposing, and so I thought of John McNabb, which of course is one of those popular books. It's one I enjoy reading as well, which for people who aren't aware is about a bunch of jaded chaps decide to go off and do a poaching challenge in the Highlands to kind of get their zest for life back. And so it's a great fun story. Even though nobody's really in danger, it's really exciting and it's enormous fun. And I thought, well, supposing a year later, those same guys went back to that part of the country to celebrate the anniversary. And while they're having their drinks after a day's, fishing, the door bashes open and Richard Hannay staggers in, bedraggled and, beaten, and says, "Gentlemen, I need your help in the most hazardous mission of our career." And I thought, that's great. But then I couldn't think what the mission was at that point. But I've been mentioning that to people and said, so he staggers in. And they said, that's great. Then what happens? I said, well, I have no idea. So I had to think about that. And then I came up with a plot involving the Kaiser. So the story takes place in a vague 1920s. And it was only while I was writing that I hit on a plot for Redfalcon. So I'd like you can zero in on any points you want to ask about.
Well, let's move on to Redfalcon. We will talk a bit more about writing in the style of other writers a bit later. But what can you tell us about Redfalcon without kind of giving anything away?
I'll get just a few things away. Well, what occurred to me was that the 31 Kings about the fall of Paris. That was like a great backdrop for it. Yeah. Like, what other part of World War II that hasn't been done to death or something could it be the springboard for another Hannay adventure, one that would suit him and not a kind of Buchan adventure? And years ago, I'd read and I'd reread it, a book by Ernle Bradford called The Great Siege, about the siege of Malta in 1565, where the Knights of St. John held the island against a massive attack by the Turks and the Ottoman Empire. And they held out there in an amazingly heroic story. And I thought, well, and then I was aware, of course, in 1942, the Germans and the Italians were like bombing the hell out of Malta. They tried to, because it was a sore in their communication lines. The British were holding the island along with the brave islanders themselves. And it was a place where they could launch raids on German supply lines to North Africa and harry their shipping and keep open a link to Egypt and the Suez Canal for the Allied forces. So that, well, if I could join those two together, I'd actually, that would be really interesting to have this. It would bring in that historical aspect because I mean, the 31 Kings is put in a context of the history of Europe where we are at that point, and this is once again is like a clash of cultures going on. And so what I had to do was come up with a way that they would be connected. And so as it transpired, I thought of a way to do it, which is the secret of the book that I won't give away. That somewhere out there's some secret that helped the Knights hold the island and would help it be held now, or would help the Germans capture it if they found out what it was. And so Hannay is given this mission to set off and get this secret before the Germans do, and keep Malta going. At this point, Malta was running low on food, supplies, everything else. And the convoys were put together, pedestal convoy, which is like a last desperate attempt to get them the supplies they need, because they don't get them, they'll have to surrender, otherwise they'll all die of hunger. So the idea of that Hannay and his crew have to actually make sure that the Germans don't spring some secret plan on them in the meantime, and the place can hold out till this convoy gets there. And the story of the convoy is touched upon through the book as a parallel. That's the real life story, alongside my fictional story of Hannay and his team heading off on this journey around the Mediterranean, kind of quite an epic James Bondian journey with elements of Indiana Jones in it as well. So
I'm glad you said that, because I definitely picked up that there was some Indiana Jones felt in it as well. And which gives listeners the idea of just kind of what a thrilling read it is. You know,
yes.
It's a page turner. You really, once you finish one chapter, wow, you've got to, it's almost like the old a Saturday morning TV series.
Yes.
To get to the next one, you know, you're left with a cliffhanger every time. And it's interesting as well that you talk about I didn't realize, because I haven't read a lot of Buchan, that the characters in the book are actually from Buchan's own legacy, his own books.
Oh yes, I mean most of them come from Buchan. Well, the Gorbals diehards from Buchan, and so mainly that the original novel Hunting Tower, the diehards appear as scruffy young boys who can't afford the uniforms to join the Boy Scouts, so they form their own thing, the Gorbals diehards, with their own oath and their own flag and everything, and they're just wonderful characters in that book. Then he does two more, but only really features Dougal and Jakey, who are the two main leaders of the group, when they're in their 20s. And so I have them and two other diehards in 31 Kings, and I have so Dougal and Jakey join in this adventure quite early on, in quite a fun way, because the government powers have decided that this is Hannay's got this team that they'll send him and his team off on this mission, and so they show up a few chapters in to join him on this epic journey around the Mediterranean, and the rest of the group are in Malta, so they do appear as well, but it's mainly Dougal and Jakey in this. And so using the Buchan characters in all the books, I've tried to use Buchan characters where I could. Some of them being very obscure. Some, I mean, there's a couple of characters in Castle MacNab that come from a novel called The Prince of the Captivity, which is one of the more obscure books a lot of people would never even have heard of. And it is a bit of an odd book. It's not one of his best, but it's very fascinating. And in this one too, like in Redfalcon, they encounter the American consul in Morocco, and he's a character who is mentioned very briefly in another Buchan novel. And it's nice if you can do that, but also at the same time you're inventing characters as well. And some of them, and then of course there's historical characters, although I try to avoid having real people in them, because I mean the governor of Gibraltar who turns up in this is actually has the name of the real character and is described as he is, but it's not a huge part. And the beautiful Greek archaeologist Carrie Adriatis, interestingly with that she's my invention, but originally I was going to use a character called Corey Arabin, who's one of the Lethan novels, The Dancing Floor, who was Greek. But when I came to get to actually doing the book, I thought, no, she brings too much baggage from early adventures. You know, it would be very difficult to kind of fit her in. But I like the idea of having a Greek character in it, that being the home of, you know, democracy and philosophy and all this great stuff and European culture. So I guess I will have my beautiful Greek archaeologist, but I'll make her myself, and I'll give her a different name and make her a tremendous character, which I believe I'm told she is.
Yes, she really is, and I think they're all memorable characters. The group that you've assembled, or that Hannay assembles, if you like, you know, really are kind of memorable in their own right. They all stand out. But I was thinking most people will know Richard Hannay from Buchan's 39 Steps, or even the TV and film adaptations, you know. But here he's in a different stage of life than if you'd seen him in the 39 Steps, isn't he? He's almost at the further end. You've set it World War II, therefore he's an older man. And you take that into account, you know, as well.
Yeah, in the 31 Kings, the first of these, he was exactly the same age as I was when I was writing it. I won't say what that is, but you know, a mature man. And then he's chafing because he's not getting into the action, being held back. So in the Redfalcon, he's on a desk job, and he'd like to be into action, but he's beginning to wonder. He's still got it in him. You know, I think in the book says something like, you know, has come to a stage in a man's life when he begins to wonder, has he got anything left in him still to do? And of course, the answer will be yes, but he has to find that out at the point where he's thinking that maybe he's been put out to pasture, but no, he's given this last great adventure to go on, and it's a pretty taxing one as it turns out. And so I think, you know, yes, so even in the 39 Steps, he's actually about 40 in that. He's actually quite a mature character in that, but a bit jaded with life. And there's 4 more Hannay novels after that. The last one's in 1935. That's the last time we see him in Buchan. And but so I was taking it on from there. It seemed like, yeah, to carry that trajectory onwards. You can imagine what you know him well from these other books, so you can see what he'd be like in this new. He would definitely want to be out there as part of serving the country and fighting for, you know, freedom and all that. And so in this book, I think it's a great way to kind of bring him and the other characters, all these younger characters he has with him, forward in this last great battle.
And it sounds as though you've really concentrated on the Hannay from the books. There was none of the other representations, as I mentioned, that have fed into it at all. You just wanted to say, no, this is John Buchan's Hannay, and this is my adaptation of it.
Yes, I mean, I'm very familiar with the films, and about that the Hitchcock film, which actually set the pattern for the film versions, where there's a woman dragged along in the adventures, and yeah, that is good. That does make it better. And so he set the pattern for that and really launched all the different versions there are. The version with Kenneth Moore isn't as good, but I think that Kenneth Moore is the nearest to Richard Hannay they've got. And he'd be the best casting for Richard Hannay. If I had a fantasy cast list, Moore would definitely play him, Kenneth Moore. But of the 3 films, my favourite is the Robert Powell version of 39 Steps.
All right.
Because it's the most faithful to the book, while at the same time expanding the story to make it a bit richer. They've got a hydro in it, which is something that turns up in Hannay books. It doesn't have in Hannay books, but it turns up in the other books. I thought that's a nice. People who've made that film, I've read their Buchan, and they know the kind of things come in Buchan. So having him be a prisoner in a hydropathic, because I used a hydropathic in Castle MacNab, my second Hannay novel. And so yeah, of the films, yes, of the BBC version from years back, we shall say nothing. We won't talk about that at all.
I remember it. Yeah, funnily enough, I watched the Kenneth Moore version fairly recently, and his performance in it is terrific. He's
great. He's everything you think you want Hannay to be. You know, he's a bit tougher than Robert Donat. He's a bit stronger looking than Robert. Robert Powell's a bit weedy to be Hannay. He puts his back into it. I mean, he certainly delivers a performance, but he's not what you think Hannay would look like. So they've all got. There's not a perfect version, but you know, and yes, you do have it does give you a sense of how exciting the story is. Watching the films, how they translate into that. So in a sense, translating the elements into a new book is something like that. So
in terms of Buchan as a writer, what is it that really kind of you admire about him?
Well, okay, we'll start with it. I mentioned before the sheer quality of the writing.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember an introduction to one of his books. It was I think it was The Powerhouse, which is one of the more loosely plotted books. You can't say it's a brilliantly plotted book. It's a good read. But I think in the introduction, someone was saying that he writes in prose that's as beautiful as classical Latin. And as I'm a classicist who studied Latin, I understand what that means.
Right.
You know, there's nothing flat about it. There's nothing dull about it. It's really great. And yet you can read it now and it doesn't read old. It still reads really fresh. Like other great ones, like H.G. Wells. You look at H.G. Wells and think, oh, this is really old, fuddy-duddy stuff. No, it still reads really fresh, and Buchan has that. And thematically, I find Buchan to be really great-hearted. I mean, he's I mean, with his Calvinist background, he still has characters. He's got, you know, he's got Andrew Amos, who's an atheist socialist who's quite a heroic character in the books. And with other novels, he's a conscientious objector in the Great War. It's presented as a heroic figure. who dies heroically at the end of the book. So he's not hidebound in any way. And his characters often, you know, the references to certain Catholic characters too show a certain sympathy with things like being able to pray for the dead and things. So he has this great thing where he can appreciate how other people see things, and what he likes so is as their honesty and their courage in their beliefs is something that's common to the characters he admires. And I think that's a message for today as well. You know, these differences, but people are sincere in what they're doing and what they mean as well, then we can kind of coexist in that way. And I'm always impressed by that in Buchan. Without getting into too many examples of how even some of the villains, there's a sympathy for them, the fact that they have a sense destroyed themselves. Even like in the fact I had a novel involving the Kaisers, because in one of Buchan's novels, Richard Hannay encounters the Kaiser. That's in Greenmantle as he's traveling across Europe at a railway station, and actually feels pity for him. That the thing is, he's in this situation, he's ruling this country, he's got them into this war, and he's not really adequate to deal with it. He's not presented as some hate figure. He's a bit sad that he's got all this trouble going, and he doesn't really know what to do with it. So there's a real humanity in Buchan that permeates all of his books. And I think it's less common than you might think, you know, and to somebody who, for going back to back to the 1900 something, to have that view, that attitude to humanity in general is a great thing and worth keeping going, worth preserving. People who read the books might be surprised to find just how strong that is in his writing.
That's a very interesting point. And will you write any more Richard Hannay novels? Have you got any further ones in the series?
I'm not planning on it. I mean, I only ever planned one in the first place. But this one, it was kind of nice because the 31 Kings is obviously meant to parallel the 39 Steps in the title. So for us, in a sense, this is as a continuation. The second Hannay novel by Buchan is called Greenmantle. So the title Redfalcon is meant to kind of be like that. If we went on it, I'd have to keep being really cleverly trying to parallel the titles. But I'd always felt like when they asked for more, I thought, well, there's a point where you can't go any further, where it gets far enough away from the original Buchan stories that it's getting harder and harder to get them Buchan-esque.
Yes.
I think this one is very much a Buchan story, but beyond that, I know. Plus, I think this one, I deliberately felt I've rounded things off.
Yes.
We had this really great, I mean, the end of the 31 Kings talks about, it gives an ending where it's like they're all riding off at the sunset, and I had no intention then of writing any more.
Yeah.
And people were saying, oh, so you've written it, can we continue? No, that wasn't my intention at all. It was like, yeah, they will have more adventures, but I'm not going to write them. So this one, I was very conscious of doing doing a trilogy and bringing it to a really great conclusion with a really, as you complimentary said earlier, you know, a really exciting story that goes through a whole breadth of exotic locations, and there's spies, and there's chases, and there's like military confrontations. There's a dog fight in the skies over the Mediterranean. I think people get their money's worth out of this, and I think the way that the book ends has brought the characters together and the thematics of it together in a way I think people feel really satisfied with that. Yeah. And I've read some series of books where you get to maybe, you know, a couple of books or 2 or 3 books and you think, oh, that's good, that's really satisfying. Well, what, they've written more? Oh, well, yeah. Well, they shouldn't have done, because this isn't as good.
I was talking to another writer who's just finished a trilogy, and he was saying, yeah, a trilogy feels like a good thing. Sometimes in terms of series, the best ones come in threes. I think that's where we go quite.
Yes, because I mean, I think it's a shame for authors who are really, really successful. Some of them, because like, oh no, what do you want? Something new for me? No, we want volume 17 of the Expector Abernethy series. You know, we just want you to keep writing the same thing over and over again. And yeah, you can't turn down the money. Luckily, I'm not successful enough. People want me to keep going. I actually have the freedom to kind of restart and do something else. So I tend to be doing trilogies of things, and I can do a whole series in that. So with this, I kind of feel done Richard Hannay justice. Now, if I was to have a massively brilliant idea for the Hannay novel, or if somebody filmed Redfalcon and they said, yes, we'll pay you to write another book beyond that, I would have to give it serious thought. But in terms of just my own satisfaction, I feel very good at rounding off the series of this book and bringing it to, I think, a really spectacular and exciting, but also very, very emotionally fulfilling conclusion to the whole story.
I would agree with that, absolutely. And you've also written Sherlock Holmes novels set against World War II.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about those? I have also.
Yeah, well, it was like before I got, yes, that's, I'm glad you got to bring those and show them off. Yes, well, for complicated reasons, of some delays, I had to, so much research and stuff to do for Redfalcon. It was during the lockdown, so I couldn't get away to go places and do things. And I thought I didn't want to get into it and have trying to go and do some of this stuff. So my eye just glanced upon my box set of DVDs of the Basil Rathbone World War II Sherlock Holmes series. Just explain to viewers, one film company made a couple of Sherlock Holmes films, Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce, which are set in Victorian times.
Yeah.
And they're based on the original works. And then they just stopped. So Universal Pictures came along and they made a pitch for it, but they part of the deal they wanted was to update it. The Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson would be in wartime London in 1942. And they made a deal with the Conan Doyle estate to do that.
Yeah.
And they're the Sherlock Holmes stories that I grew up on, on Sunday afternoons on TV. Yeah. Basil Rathbone with Sherlock Holmes, and it never really jarred me. So many years later, I'd watched them all. We had the collection, we collected them all, and we watched them with my children. They were younger, and the whole family would gather around and love them, the atmosphere of them. And this is what Sherlock Holmes is like. I think they did such a great job of keeping Holmes and Watson true to the originals, even though they're now in World War II and they've got cars and telephones and all that. I think they did a really wonderful job of staying true to the characters because they had the best actors to do it.
Yeah. And
so I was thinking to myself, hang on a second, because I'd written a series of for younger readers called the Arthur Conan Doyle Mysteries, which is about these fictional adventures of Arthur Conan Doyle as a boy in Edinburgh solving mysteries, which would, in a sense, supposedly later inspire him to write Sherlock Holmes stories. And it crossed my mind, to do a Sherlock Holmes novel, but there are actually a lot of Sherlock Holmes pastiches out there. I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of them of varying quality. And I thought, if I did another one, it was like nobody would care. It wouldn't make any impact. But I thought, hang on a second, nobody's ever done that. Nobody's ever taken those wartime films and done that as a novel. And I thought that the films work so well, I think it could work as a novel as well. So that was the incentive to do that, which then meant I had to go from Richard Hannay's voice to Dr. Watson's voice. A friend of mine who'd been reading them both said it's amazing how he could say that they're very different, the two voices that they have, the narrative, the way they tell the story. And he said, how do you go between them? I said, I don't really think about it, because as with reading all the Buchan, I just read the Conan Doyle to get that, and also watch those films to get how they deliver lines in that. And so that having done that, in America, the Sherlock Holmes books have probably quite taken off. So I'm hoping to do a third one with the American publishers, even if it doesn't come out here to start off with, because I've really been enjoying doing that. And of course, I never actually intended to spend so much time in World War II. It's just happened that way. So I've learned an awful lot about World War II over the past several years in writing these books. And writing Holmes and Watson, you're dealing with a sort of parallel universe. They're writing these books about them, but they weren't born in Victorian times. In the Great War, they would have been young men and would have served in the Great War. Where in the original Sherlock Holmes stories, Holmes is about 60 when World War I's about to begin. He's kind of doing a spying mission. So I had to work on a timeline for the two of them of what they did in the First World War. And luckily, Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce both served quite heroically in the Great War. And so that was some of the inspiration for it, was what they'd actually done. And then carrying them on to World War II. So but they had to end up as the same characters as we meet in Conan Doyle. It's a bit like, you take the train to Inverness via Dundee or Perth. You might take a different route, but when you get there, it's the same place. And so they would come across as being the same characters. But it gave me a bit of a freedom to sort of, because there's a lot of mystery to the background of Sherlock Holmes. You know very little about his earlier life and outside of the adventures in the books. And this gave me a certain freedom to work with that and to create a backstory for him. And so it was a wonderful thing to do. So I've done two of them. In the first one, they have a modern day version of Jack the Ripper and the blacked out streets of London, and which is a great setting for a killer. And in the second one, they have to stop somebody who's burning people alive with some similar device, and they are forced to some extent to ally with Professor Moriarty in that. Because all along, when I thought of doing these books, I had this great idea that if Professor Moriarty was a real man, he would be in charge of Bletchley Park, the big decoding centre. He'd be obviously the man to be there. And so, but he's still the criminal mastermind, and he's running the intelligence network. So that story was great fun to take on Moriarty and have them meet at the Reichenbach Falls at the end, and do my own version of the Reichenbach Falls. So it's nice to touch on all those things without just kind of redoing them over and over again, to have a fresh take on them all. So so I've ended up doing the common thread. Of course, is that these are great Scottish writers. You know, Conan Doyle and Buchan. You know, there's like a whole tradition, I think, going from Sir Walter Scott, like creating the historical novel. Then you go to Stevenson, you know, and you've got Treasure Island and great adventure stories, and you go on through Conan Doyle, Buchan, and probably on into Alistair MacLean and Ian Fleming, both also Scottish, and writing really famous adventure stories. So I've kind of woven myself in there, I think, along the way among their works. So that's a bit about the Sherlock Holmes, because I've always been I loved Sherlock Holmes. I came to Buchan later. Once I did, I was devouring them. Historical novels, everything. I've really enjoyed so many of those. And I think Scotland in particular, something about Scotland, the Scottish people, produce the greatest adventure story writers. The tradition of those, from Ivanhoe, you know, up to Where Eagles Dare, I think, you know, this and James Bond, I think is you can follow a line there. I think I can see that there's something going on in the Scottish water or blood or something that's producing all this.
And are there any other Scottish writers that you would fancy taking on?
No. I think, you know, Redfalcon has certain Alistair MacLeanish elements, because you're getting into that period. And I was reading Alistair MacLean, you know, for the kind of World War II, but I don't see me writing James Bond. My next project is actually completely different from all of that. It's a perilous move into something new and different.
Before we move on from Sherlock Holmes and Holmes and Watson together, what do you think it is about those two that endures? Because obviously recently we've had a big TV success, Robert Downey Jr. film version. So they are characters that still seem to endure. It's
pretty amazing, isn't it? I mean, I subscribed to the Sherlock Holmes magazine. I first got it because they asked me to do an article about my first Sherlock Holmes book. And so I got hooked and got a subscription. I'm now writing articles for them because you get drawn into Sherlock Holmes. I don't know what it is. I've written an article about what really happened at the Reichenbach Falls and other stuff like that. So, and the fascination never ends. There's just something magical about that. Conan Doyle, of course, is a great writer. He wrote other great books too. But Sherlock Holmes, it's almost like if you try too hard to define it, you'll spoil it. You might ruin it if you try too hard to work out why it is. But I think there's a great Sherlock Holmes is somebody we would turn to in trouble, like people do in trouble turn to Sherlock Holmes. He has a tremendous sense of justice, I think, and that's really important. Where he will let somebody go who's done something wrong, but he'll let them go if that's the right thing to do. Yes. He's not bound by the law. And I think that tremendous integrity and intelligence he brings is something that never falters. Even if you do, I mean, I think it was Scottish TV actually years ago made a science fiction version, Sherlock Holmes in the 24th century or something, which is actually quite a good show. You can find it on YouTube. And he just endures in all these different ways. And it's why, like, you know, when I'm writing my Sherlock Holmes novels, even though it's set in the 1940s, Sherlock Holmes is still, we know who Sherlock Holmes is. He's got to be like this, and I've written him. Yeah, he and Watson have got to be this way, and Dr. Watson is kind of like us, tagging along after Sherlock Holmes. Many people have tried to analyze this and have failed badly. So that's about as far as I could get with it. But yes, I read my first, I think in my teens or something. I got a book at the library of Sherlock Holmes. I read the Red-Headed League first, thinking it'd be about some league of ginger-headed mastermind trying to take over the world, and it's nothing like that, but it's such a great story. And so I've been with Sherlock Holmes ever since then. Back then, never imagining I'd be writing any of it. So yes, your guess is as good as mine as to what the magic is, as long as we keep enjoying them and people do. I said with Buchan and Conan Doyle reads so easily. Conan Doyle doesn't read like some old, he writes very well and very engagingly, and there's tremendous humor in the Holmes stories, as there are in Buchan as well. There's some wonderfully funny bits in Buchan too, which I do try to emulate here and there. I think I could, if I could give away a bit of a Redfalcon. Well, the basic idea being they start off in spy chase in southern England, then they go to Gibraltar, then they go to Casablanca, where of course there's allusions to the movie. Yes. Then off to the Atlas Mountains of Morocco, and then off to Malta, and so it's very James Bondian. I mean, on the DVD extras on the James Bond films I've got, the two writers, unusual for writers to get any credit in these things, but they were saying the important thing about James Bond is he never goes backwards. He always goes on to someplace new all the way through. So in this book, they go all the way along. And but the funny bit in the book that I enjoyed doing was that over the lockdown, my son had his wedding, and he and the groomsmen were all in the kilts and everything, and they had the whole gear on. And I thought bringing Dougal and Jake into the story, it'd be really funny if they just come straight from Jakey's wedding. He'd just gotten married. And they got this message to head south and support Hannay. So when they arrive, they come tumbling out the car and they've forgotten their civilian gear. So they're dressed in this Highland garb. And they have to sneak up on some bad guys holding a prisoner in a mill. I'd not thought this through up to that point, but I thought, hang on a second, there isn't any way they can sneak up dressed the way they are. And I thought, what would they do then? So, okay, they came up with the plan. They would stagger up there, pretending to be drunk Scotsmen from some regiment there and get the drop on the bad guys that way. So I was laughing out loud myself a bit in that chapter as they get to be these cliche drunken Scotsmen meeting a couple of East End London hard cases and getting the better of them. So, and I think Buchan would have enjoyed that. I think there's many bits in Buchan books which are not exactly like that, but they play off how funny they are. Like when Richard Hannay has to pretend he's like a Liberal Party candidate, and I think Archie Royland has to do something like that as well. And so so that was good fun to write in a book that's essentially very serious and full of epic grandeur. There's a chance to get some real humor out of the characters in that way. So I've rambled on there away from Sherlock Holmes onto that.
I mean, I think that's interesting as well. Just as you were talking, it strikes me that these characters, Holmes, Hannay, you mentioned Bond, they're all, even though they're often working with the establishment, they're kind of anti-establishment, or at least they push against it. And I think that's an interesting aspect of it as well.
Yes, they're nobody's dog's body.
Yeah.
And they will do what they think is right when it comes right down to it.
And we've only touched on your other books that you've written over the years. Where's the best place if people want to know more about your writing and yourself? Where's the best place they can do that?
Well, I do have a website, which is, do we still say www? No, harris-authors.com, all lowercase. And that's got, it's needing updating. I've not caught up with latest events, but it's got a list of all the books and synopses and stuff about me, which is updating too. But there's plenty there. Also, my wife's books, she had a career for a while writing fantasy novels. She was the author and co-author of 13 novels. And between what she wrote and what I wrote, my next book, when it comes out next year, will be the 35th novel from the Harris thing. We've both done collaboration with other authors and solo work. But you know, sometimes I look at a book and it says other books by this author. I mean, how do they find time to write all that? I thought, well, actually, between the two of us, we've done that. We've created a huge body of work, which is like, well, that's good. That feels like a real achievement. And still going strong.
That's good to hear. And I should say that the Sherlock Holmes books and the Richard Hannay books are all published by Polygon. So you go over to
all available from the publisher.
Absolutely. You can get them all there. Robert, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been great.
But we will be back soon on the Scots Whay Hae podcast with someone completely different.